Think of the richest people in the world, and names like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Oprah Winfrey springs to mind. While those folks are definitely loaded, their wealth might pale in comparison to the riches occurred by many people who preceded them. Some of these names will be familiar. You might find a surprise or two along the way as we check out 16 of the richest people in world history. And a little accounting FYI, all the figures are presented in US dollars and represented the subject's peak worth, and have been adjusted for inflation. 16. Stephen Gerrard, 120 billion. He made his money in banking, which kinda makes sense, but he also owned a fleet of trading ships and was a merchant. He did so well in those endeavors that he amassed a fortune estimated around $120 billion. Gerrard had enough money to bail out the US government from the financial collapse during the War of 1812. 15. Hisham, 132 billion. Now this guy wasn't a king or potentate, he was actually a government official who lived during the Qing dynasty in China and served the emperor. Hisham evidently served himself pretty well too, because he was favoured by the Imperia. Hisham was able to steal tax revenues on a massive scale. Upon his death in 1799, Hisham was found to have stashed away a personal fortune of some 132 billion in today's money. Who said crime doesn't pay? 14. Bill Gates, 144 billion. Microsoft's co-founder was held the title of world's richest American for 24 years straight, and is often regarded as the world's richest person, in modern times anyway. At one point during the dot-com bubble in 1999, his fortune peaked to around $144 billion. Nothing micro about that number. These days, Gates' fortune is estimated in the 90 billion range. Did you know that at one point in 2017, Gates yielded his title of world's richest person to Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, and his stock surged. By the end of that day, the stock retreated and Gates retained his title. Number 13. William D. Warren, 146 billion. The first Earl of Surrey was a Norman nobleman who lived in the 11th century and fought alongside William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. In his time, De Warren was considered to be amongst the biggest real estate moguls in England. He owned extensive holdings in land in at least 13 countries, including Sussex. His collection of manors and castles ranged from Norfolk to Yorkshire to Essex, and would have totaled up to around $146 billion. 12. John Jacob Astor, 168 billion. He more associated with real estate, but Astor initially made his fortune in the fur trade, where he established a formidable monopoly that controlled fur trading in Canada and in the US in the 19th century. Later, he saw the potential of New York City and made shrewd investments in the real estate there. Regarded as America's first multimillionaire, the merchant and real estate mogul left a fortune valued at $168 billion at its peak in today's money. Overall, he's thought to be the 5th richest person in US history. Number 11. Alan Rufus, 195 billion. The Normans evidently had a knack for making tons of money. Alan Rufus was a compatriot of William the Conqueror during the Northern conquests. The aristocrat benefited from the patronage of the wealthy William, who was also Rufus' uncle. Maybe it was a case of keeping money in the family, but Alan became one of the most powerful figures in England, and among the wealthiest. When he died in the late 11th century, his fortune was estimated at around 195 billion, or about 1/7 of England's GDP. 10. Henry Ford, 200+ billion. The Ford Motor Company pioneered the assembly line method of mass production, and that helped to reap massive products for founder Henry Ford. Although he didn't invest the auto or the assembly line, his genius was in producing a car that was affordable enough for many Americans to afford. More than 1 million Model T cars were sold in 1920, and at one point half of all his cars on US roads were Model Ts. No wonder that Ford left behind a fortune of some $200 billion. 9. Cornelius Vanderbilt, 202 billion. This business magnate kind of epitomize the range of Richest success stories. Born poor, he acquired little formal education, but Vanderbilt used his intelligence and perseverance to build a fortune in the shipping and railroad industries. In addition to his great wealth, he was a patriarch of an industrial family, as well as a noted farm philanthropist. He was thought to have been worth more than $200 billion at his peak. Number 8. Muammar Gadaffi, $212 billion. Maybe you wouldn't have expected to see this name on the list. The dictator of Libya was a widely divisive political figure who had plenty of conflicts in the US and Western nations. Following the civil war in Libya in 2011, Gadaffi was captured and killed by rebel forces. Libyan officials later revealed the colonel had numerous secret bank accounts and had engaged in many shady real estate deals and stolen Libya's huge oil revenues as well throughout his rule. In this case, it's difficult to completely distinguish his personal wealth from that of the Libyan state, but it's estimated that those deals and assets would have been worth some $212 billion at his peak. Number 7. William the Conqueror, $228 billion. We've already mentioned a couple of Normans previously on the list, so it only makes sense to mention who is perhaps the most famous Norman of them all. If you were paying attention during history class, or either on the list, you know that the Battle of Hastings happened in the year 1066. That's when William the Conqueror invaded England and quickly plundered treasures and the sea's land holdings. All of those spoils taken during the conquest are estimated to be worth some $228 billion, but that figure doesn't include any fortunes occurred during William's reign as monarch. Number 6. Yakko Fuga, $277 billion. Never heard of Yakko? He was likely a bit before your time, or mine up for matter. Living in the 16th century, in his day, this guy was thought to be the richest man in Europe. The German merchant was also a banker and a mining entrepreneur. The founder of his wealth, and his family's, was the textile trade, and held a near monopoly on the copper market in Europe. That helped to enable Fuga to amuse such wealth that he became a political player, helping to bankroll the monarchies of King Charles V of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, with a net worth estimated anywhere from $277 to some $400 billion. No wonder why he was known for Yakko the Rich. 5. Osman Ali Khan, $230 billion. Recognized as the final ruler of Hyderabad in India, Khan was the unquestioned authority from 1911 to 1948. In 1937, Khan's portrait was on the cover of Times magazine as the richest man in the world, and indeed he was recognized as the richest person in the world during much of his life. A lot of that great wealth was the result of money inherited from the diamond trade. In the 18th century, Hyderabad's state was the sole supplier of diamonds for the world's market. As ruler, Khan had his very own mint, which printed currency as well as private treasury. At its peak, Khan's fortune was estimated around $230 billion. Number 4. Tsar Nicholas II, Russia, $300 billion. Starting in 1894, Nicholas Romanov ruled the Russian Empire, which collapsed upon his forced abdication in 1917. He was considered to be one of the richest monarchs in history. A lot of his wealth is thought to have come from an asset owned by the state as property of the crown. Because of that, estimates of Tsar's wealth fluctuate widely. Overall, historians estimate Nicholas's fortune could have amounted of some $300 billion. But there are plenty of sources that claim that Tsar's personal fortune was only a fraction of that. Number 3. Andrews Carnegie, $337 billion. This immigrant from Scotland became a titan in the American railroad and steel industries during the late 19th century. When he created US Steel in 1901, he was recognized as the world's first company with a market capitalization of $1 billion or more. His personal net worth was estimated at nearly $340 billion. But by the time he died in 1919, Carnegie had given away the bulk of his fortune to various philanthropic causes. That included the establishment of some 300,000 public libraries across the US, Canada, Britain, and other English-speaking nations. Number 2. John D. Rockefeller, 367 billion. You might have guessed that anyone who funds a company called Standard Oil would have made their fortune from the vicious liquid. Such is the case for Mr. Rockefeller, who at his peak controlled nearly 90% of the oil in the US. That monopoly led to his company being broken up into 34 separate entities, which would later include Chevron and ExxonMobil, amongst others. That enabled Rockefellers to become the first billionaire in the US, with a fortune that was nearly 2% of the country's national economy. At its peak, Rockefeller's fortune was estimated at around $367 billion. Hey, we hope you're enjoying the list of the richest people in history. It's pretty cool seeing just how wealthy a lot of these people were, especially after adjusting those amounts of inflation. Well, during our research, we found a few other historical figures that were said to have tremendous fortunes. We didn't include them in the official list for a couple of reasons, including that some sources couldn't verify the numbers, or in the case of rulers, it was difficult to separate personal fortunes from assets owned by the state. In the case of someone like King Solomon, estimates of his wealth are based on biblical accountants, which claim he may have held a fortune of more than $2 trillion. Augustus Caesar held a personal fortune equivalent to roughly 20% of Roman Empire's economy. Today, that will work out to around $4.6 trillion. Akbar I was an Indian emperor who ruled over thousands of square miles across the subcontinent. Some experts say that during his reign in 1556 to 1605, he commanded about 25% of the world's gross domestic product, or some 21 trillion in today's money. Shenzong, the Chinese emperor, ruled during the 11th century and was said to control 30% of the world's GDP, or 30 trillion or more. And how about Genghis Khan? Until his death in 1277, he controlled about 12 million square miles of land. Those territories would now be worth hundreds of trillions of dollars. Now, let's move on to our number 1 richest person in history. Number 1. Mansa Musa, King of Timbuktu, 415 billion. We found that a lot of sources cited Mansa Musa was the wealthiest person in history. Mansa, by the way, is actually a title that roughly translates to king or emperor. And when Musa I of Mali died in 1337, his wealth was estimated at about $400 billion, and likely more. His West African kingdom of Timbuktu was thought to be the world's largest supplier of gold at the time, which definitely helped the revenues. Exploitations of the realm's salt production was another key contributor to his wealth. Overall, records are scarce, if non-existent, so there's no way to put an exact number to Musa's wealth, but most pictures portray him as surrounded by gold, and reports during his lifetime describe Musa as inconceivably rich.